Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Job chapter 3 in our continuing study of the book of Job. We started off, we looked at chapters 1 and 2 last time. That was the historical prologue. When we get to the end of the book of Job, we'll see an epilogue where the rest of the story is finished. But in the interim, from chapter 3 to chapter 41, are going to be the poetry section of this book, the dialogues and the discourse. And we come to this point here in chapter 3, where Job first speaks. That's actually going to be poetic. He's going to actually speak in poetry. So, chapter 3, verse 1, afterward, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Notice when we say this, the words his birth, the word birth is italicized in our translation. That's the translator's way of letting you know they added that word. I think they were correct. When we see the day of his birth, it's Yomu, that is his day, actually, literally. And remember how we saw back in chapter 1 where the children of Job, both his sons and his daughters, they would each meet at different children's homes and celebrate their day. So this is his day. And I suggested maybe that was speaking about their birthday. And I think that Job is doing the same thing when he curses his day. That's the day of his birth. I think the translators are correct. And we saw in chapter 2 where Job's wife had said, curse God and die. Job wouldn't do that. But instead, we see here now he curses the day when he became alive, the day that was his day. And he curses that. And now he begins, verse 3, let the day perish on which I was to be born. We weren't sure about verse 1, but verse 3 actually mentions the day in which he was to be born. So I think they're both speaking of the same thing. And the night which said a boy is conceived. Notice the day and the night. This is in parallel. So you have a reference to the day, you have a reference to the night where he was to be born. A boy is conceived. This is when you look at Hebrew parallelism, what you do is you say it, and then you say the same thing, but with a slightly different emphasis, different words maybe, and that's known as sort of a parallel. Where you're saying exactly the same thing. Now you could say it in opposite terms, but that's not here. This is going to be used using different words for the same thing. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. That's part of the curse that he is calling upon the day of his birth. Verse 5, let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, let darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Just strike it off the calendar. I'm not sure if they had calendars back then, but they would recognize days and weeks and months and years and things like that. Um, so just strike it off the calendar. As far as the day I was born, that was not a good day. That was a bad day. Verse 7, behold, let that night be barren. This is part of the curse. Let no joyful shout enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are prepared to rouse Leviathan. Now, that term Leviathan, you say, well, what's the Hebrew word there? Actually, that is the Hebrew word. Leviathan is the Hebrew, and the translators, sometimes the translators will do this. They're not sure exactly how to translate a word, so they'll take the Hebrew word and they'll just put it into English letters, the same Hebrew word, and that's what happens here. So what is Leviathan? Some sort of animal. Some folks have thought of it as sort of a mythological beast, perhaps. Others have actually some, when we get to another, you're going to have a later reference to Leviathan, and people are going to say, gee, that looks like, some sort of great monster. Is it a dragon? Is it a dinosaur? Is it an alligator? Whatever it is, it's really big. And the mythology of the day, we actually see this term used in other Middle Eastern cultures where they would say Leviathan, that was the one who who would come and perhaps gobble up the stars. And, if they saw a lunar eclipse, they'd say, oh, a Leviathan is at work. He's taking a bite of the moon. Hopefully he can't keep it down and it'll come back. So notice the reference here in verse 9, let the stars of its twilight be darkened. Let it wait for light, but have none. Let it not see the breaking dawn, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb or hide trouble from my eyes. That day that I was born, because of that, all of these things have taken place, all of the tragedy that has befallen Job's life. We get to verse 11. He asks a series of rhetorical questions. These are not meant to be answered. The question actually speaks to the pain through which he's going. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Notice saying the same thing. Die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire is just two different ways of saying the same thing. Verse 12, why did the knees receive me? And why the breasts that I should suck? Notice the knees and the breasts, parts of his mother that were involved. And he's, why was I even born? Considering all the tragedy that has befallen him. Verse 13, for now I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept then. I would have been at rest. So I would have done these things. I would have laid down. I would have slept. I would have been at rest. Notice, with kings, with counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who were filling their houses with silver. That would have been a great life. But contrary, would have been like that, or like a miscarriage, which is discarded, just run away. I would not be. As infants that never saw light. And so, when I was born, it was unknown what I would be. But now that I've seen that, wouldn't it have been better not to have lived at all than to have gone through such great pain in which I now find myself? Verse 17, there, that is the place of the miscarriage, the place of the child that dies, there the wicked cease from raging, and there the weary are at rest. Notice that term rest, because we're going to come back to that. The prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. All of these things are describing the place of death. Now, he's not talking about life after death, heaven and hell. That's not in his view, because that had not yet been revealed. I'm not saying they weren't real. I'm just saying Job is unaware of them, and both Job the person and the author of Job, whoever that could be, is not writing on that level. He's just saying, look, you look at the dead, they're not struggling from what you can see. Their body is just there in the ground. Verse 20, why, we're back to the why questions, why is light given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death? And that's what's happening. He almost wishes, look, I'm not going to suicide. That's just not in him. But who long for death, but there is none, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice greatly and exult when they find the grave. He's not going to kill himself, but he's at the point where, look, if he dies right now, that would, at least as he sees it, put an end to his physical sufferings. And notice verse 23. Now the translators added another why, but I think it's right, because it's picking up the question that we began with in verse 20. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? Remember how Satan had accused God of putting a hedge around Job to protect him. Now Job describes himself as being hedged by God, that is outside of the protection. He's on the, you could say if he's in there with the thorns and the bad things, but there's a hedge in a negative sort of way. Verse 24, for my groaning comes at the sight of my food, and my cries pour out like water. For what I fear comes upon me. Remember how that Job had been afraid that maybe his sons and daughters had acted wrongly, had said some wrong things when they shouldn't have, and so he had acted the part of the priest on their behalf. But now he says, for what I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I'm going through my worst nightmare. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet, and I am not at rest, but turmoil comes. And I read this about Job's restlessness, and it reminds me of the words of Jesus, who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." There's a sense in which Jesus is the answer to Job's pain, his suffering, and his restlessness, because Jesus is the one who suffered and died for us. Now, in Job's pain, several things we can learn. First of all, I think we're meant to vicariously experience his pain. We're sitting in our soft, easy chair, listening to a video, but we are meant to just experience a little bit of the great pain and loss that he was going through without experiencing it ourselves. Hopefully your children and my children are not going to die and have this sort of thing. You're not going to go through the boils, but you can perhaps just experience a little bit of that in Job's case, to share in that experience. And we experience it now when things are not difficult, so that we can be better prepared when we experience it in reality. And some of you might experience that in reality, or some of you might hold the hand or be with somebody who does experience either the pain or the loss or the tragedy. I have an acquaintance right now, back from my firefighter days, who's going through great emotional pain because he's lost his son. And it's a terrible thing, and we're at that point where I'm listening to his words, but he's not ready to be given this advice or that advice, and I shouldn't be giving it. I'm in the place right now of his friends that sit with him and sit with Job and experience the pain with him. And so yes, I experienced it, and I reply to it, carefully, just to let him know I'm there to hear his pain. And we do that in the case of Job, so that in a sense we're ready for it. Now, you can't ever really be ready for it, but that we are better prepared when it comes in reality. There's a lesson here. Don't doubt in the darkness what you learned in the light. And right now, hopefully, as you hear this, you're in the light, not in that dark place, but you learn it now, so that if you do come to that dark place, now you're prepared to be there. Thirdly, I want you to see that Job's pain is being used for our gain. That is, Job went through it so that we can read his book, the book that that tells the story both of his loss and the exploration of that. And we're going to see lots of exploration. That's what the whole center part of the book is going to be, so that we might benefit from his experience. And think about how many have read the book of Job and how many have benefited from the suffering of this one man. James chapter 5, verses 10 and 11 mention Job, where the writer, James, the author of the epistle, says, "As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured." And now we might get specific. "You have heard of the endurance of Job, and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings." You see, as Job was going through it, he hadn't read the end of the story yet. But we're going to do that. We read the beginning, we're in the middle part, and eventually we'll read the end. The outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. In Job chapter 3, Job hasn't seen the mercy of God yet, but he will. He will come face to face with just who God is, and in that, he'll come to understand God's mercy, his compassion, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. And for our part, we look at the one that became flesh for us and suffered much more than we can suffer, and that his pain is our gain as we trust in Jesus, as we trust in the one who suffered in our behalf. And we experience that And there we find the place of compassion and mercy.